On April 25th, 2026, a coordinated wave of attacks hit multiple cities across Mali at the same time. Rebels and jihadist fighters struck Bamako, Gao, Sévaré, and the northern city of Kidal, all in a single morning. Mali's own defense minister was killed in a suicide truck bombing at his residence in the fortified military town of Kadi. Russian mercenaries, operating under the name Africa Corps, were caught completely off guard. The regional governor of Kidal had actually warned Russian commanders 3 days before the attack. They did nothing. Within hours of the assault beginning, Russian and Malian forces were surrounded inside the city, trapped inside their own base, and forced to negotiate their exit with the rebel fighters who had just defeated them. They drove out in trucks, filmed by armed men on motorcycles watching them leave. They left behind burned vehicles, abandoned tanks, a downed helicopter, and a city they had spent years and significant resources trying to hold. This is not just a story about one African city falling to rebels. This is a story about an empire that tried to fight on two fronts at once, and is now paying the price on both of them. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back to the beginning and understand exactly how Russia got into Mali in the first place, and what they were trying to prove. Mali has been trapped in a brutal and expanding insurgency since 2012. For years, French troops stationed across the Sahel region held the line against jihadist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS that were spreading through the desert and into civilian populations. But the relationship between Mali's military government and France had turned deeply sour. The Malian junta grew tired of French troops operating on their soil with conditions attached, conditions about governance, human rights, and political reform. By 2021, they had made their decision. French forces were told to leave. Thousands of French troops who had been keeping the insurgency partially contained packed up and withdrew. The vacuum they left behind was enormous. Moscow moved in immediately. Russia sent the Wagner Group into Mali, a private mercenary army that answered to its founder Yevgeny Prigozhin, a former convict turned catering mogul, turned warlord with deep Kremlin connections. Wagner had already been operating across Africa for years, in Sudan, Libya, the Central African Republic, and beyond. They had a formula. They would offer governments a deal with no political conditions attached, no lectures about democracy, no pressure about corruption or human rights. Just military muscle, delivered fast, paid for either with cash or with access to the country's natural resources. In the Central African Republic, Wagner fighters had helped prop up the government in exchange for access to gold, diamonds, and timber. They were looking to repeat that model in Mali. Wagner arrived in Mali at the end of 2021 and began operating alongside the Malian armed forces. They went after rebel-held territory in the north, trained Malian soldiers, and participated in direct combat operations. They also began committing the kind of atrocities that had followed them everywhere else. Villages were raided, civilians were executed. Ethnic Fulani communities, accused without evidence of collaborating with jihadists, were targeted in systematic violence. But the Malian junta looked the other way because Russia was delivering results, or at least the appearance of results. And then came November 2023, Russia's proudest moment in Mali. Wagner fighters, fighting alongside Malian forces, captured Kidal. This was a city that had been the unofficial headquarters of Tuareg separatists for over a decade. The Tuareg are a nomadic ethnic group from the Sahara Desert who had been fighting for an independent homeland called Azawad in northern Mali for years. Kidal was their stronghold. Losing it was a symbolic blow. And when Wagner troops raised their flag over the city and posed for photographs, Russia broadcast the victory to the world. This, they said, was proof that Moscow could do what France could not. This was Russia as liberator, Russia as effective security partner, Russia as the future of African sovereignty. The high point did not last. 8 months after capturing Kidal in the summer of 2024, Tuareg fighters launched a counterattack in the northern border town of Tinzaouaten. They ambushed a column of Russian mercenaries and Malian soldiers. At least 20 Wagner fighters were killed. Many more were wounded. Russian war. Bloggers, who had spent months celebrating the Kidal victory, were suddenly reporting deaths and tactical failures. The image of Russian invincibility in the Sahel cracked for the first time. And then things got even more complicated in a different direction entirely. In June 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner's founder and the man who had built the group from a small private army into a global force, launched a short-lived armed rebellion against the Russian military leadership. He marched his fighters toward Moscow and then, for reasons that were never fully explained, turned back. 2 months later, Prigozhin was dead. His private plane was blown out of the sky. Nobody was officially charged. Nobody needed to be. Everyone understood exactly what had happened. With Prigozhin gone, the Kremlin had to do something about the thousands of Wagner fighters scattered across multiple African countries. They couldn't just leave them in place as an independent force with no clear loyalty. Putin had just watched what a private army with an independent commander could do. So Moscow created the Africa Corps, a new organization placed directly under the Russian Defense Ministry. It was not a private company anymore. It was a government unit with government accountability. Some Wagner fighters agreed to sign new contracts. Many resisted. The Africa Corps was built, partly from Wagner's ranks, but it operated on different principles. It was more cautious, more bureaucratic, more defensive in its approach. Where Wagner had been aggressive and willing to take enormous risks for potential rewards, the Africa Corps was measured and restrained. That difference in approach would prove to be a critical vulnerability. Russia kept pumping resources into Mali even as warning signs mounted. In the first 5 months of 2025, 3 separate major military convoys arrived in the Malian capital Bamako. We are talking about Russian-made trucks, battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, and even boats. Moscow was not pulling back. Moscow was doubling down. Analysts at the Sentry, a security research group, noted that these deliveries came during one of the most difficult periods Russia had experienced in Mali, and concluded that the Kremlin was choosing to escalate rather than reassess. But equipment alone could not solve the fundamental problems the Africa Corps was facing. The counterinsurgency was not working. In central and northern Mali, jihadist groups continued to hold territory and expand their influence. The Africa Corps was not pushing them back in any meaningful way, and the violence against civilians was continuing to grow. Human Rights Watch documented how Malian forces, working alongside Russian mercenaries, deliberately killed at least 32 civilians and burned over 100 homes in the second half of 2024. In January 2025, at least 10 people were arbitrarily executed, including women and a 2-year-old child. The Africa Corps was not winning the fight. It was terrorizing the population and making the insurgency stronger, not weaker. By the time April 2026 arrived, the security situation in northern Mali had deteriorated significantly. The Azawad Liberation Front, the new political and military umbrella for Tuareg separatists, had been building its forces and establishing coordination with JNIM, the al-Qaeda-linked jihadist coalition that operates across the Sahel. What happened on April 25th was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a planned, coordinated, multi-city offensive designed to overwhelm Russian and Malian defenses simultaneously. Fighters struck Bamako, the capital. They struck Gao, a major northern city. They struck Sevare, which sits near critical military bases. And they struck Kidal, the city Russia had spent so much political capital claiming as a symbol of its success. All of it happened at the same time. The scale and coordination of the assault shocked observers. Analysts noted afterward that the Africa Corps and the Malian military clearly failed to detect either the scale or the timing of the operation, despite advance warning signals that were apparently present. In Kidal specifically, Africa Corps fighters found themselves surrounded and cut off inside their base. They were trapped. They could not break out through military force, so they did something that tells you everything you need to know about the situation. They called in Algeria to mediate. They negotiated a safe passage deal with the rebel fighters who had surrounded them. In exchange for a guaranteed exit route, they agreed to withdraw from the city. Russian soldiers drove out in trucks while armed rebel fighters watched from the sides of the road. Multiple videos captured the scene and spread across social media within hours. The flag that Russia had raised over Kidal in 2023 came down. The city was declared free by the Azawad Liberation Front. Russia immediately tried to control the narrative. The Africa Corps issued a statement claiming the withdrawal was a joint decision made with the Malian government. The Russian Defense Ministry claimed that its forces had inflicted massive losses on the attacking fighters and had prevented a coup, saving the Malian president from being overthrown. They claimed without offering any evidence that the attacking force included Ukrainian and European mercenaries, a claim that analysts described as narrative management rather than documented fact. But no amount of statements could change what the videos showed. One analyst said it directly. This was not a voluntary strategic sea repositioning. This was a tactical defeat. You do not negotiate your exit with the enemy from a position of strength. Now let us zoom out and look at what this actually means at a strategic level, because the loss of Kidal in Mali does not exist in isolation. It connects directly to something much larger happening thousands of miles away. Russia has been fighting in Ukraine since 2022. The numbers involved are staggering. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, between February 2022 and the end of 2025. That is more losses than any major power has suffered in any conflict since the Second World War. In 2025 alone, approximately 415,000 Russian advance in Ukraine's most contested areas has been measured in meters, sometimes as low as 15 to 70 meters of territory gained per day. Russia is advancing, but it is advancing the way a glacier moves, slowly, continuously, and at enormous cost. The economic picture is just as grim. Russia's manufacturing sector declined at its fastest rate since the initial shock of the 2022 invasion. Economic growth slowed to 0.6% in 2025. Ukraine launched systematic strikes against Russian oil refineries, hitting 10 major facilities and disrupting at least 17% of Russia's daily refinery capacity. Gas stations in Crimea and southern Russia ran dry. The International Energy Agency reported that revenues from Russian oil product exports fell to 5-year lows in August 2025. A Russian official privately warned that a banking crisis was possible. The war economy that Putin built to sustain the conflict is showing fractures that cannot be patched over with propaganda. And yet the war in Ukraine continues. Putin has not backed down. He has not negotiated on terms that reflect reality on the ground. He continues to push his forces forward, paying extraordinary costs for what independent analysts describe as minimal gains. The logic seems to be that Russia can outlast Ukraine and Western support through sheer attrition, grinding on until the other side breaks first. Whether that logic holds or not remains to be seen. But what is certain is that this war is consuming Russian military and economic resources at a rate that leaves very little margin for errors or adventures elsewhere. This is where Mali becomes more than just a local story. Every soldier in the Afrika Korps is a soldier not available in Ukraine. Every tank shipped to Bamako in those convoys was a tank not available for the front lines in Donetsk. Every ruble spent maintaining Russian influence in the Sahel is a ruble not available for a war economy already running under visible strain. Russia made a strategic choice to pursue global influence. At the same time, it was fighting the most expensive land war in Europe since 1945. That choice made sense when Russia believed the Ukraine war would be short. It made sense when oil revenues were high and Western sanctions had not yet fully bitten. It made sense when the Wagner Group was generating profits from mining operations to partly fund itself. None of those conditions hold anymore. The loss of Kidal tears apart the story Russia has been telling about itself in Africa. For years, Russia sold itself to African governments as the alternative to Western colonialism. France left Mali and made things worse. Russia came in and made things better. That was the pitch. Kidal in 2023 was the evidence, but Kidal in 2026 is now evidence of something completely different. It shows that Russia's Afrika Korps can be beaten. It shows that Russian forces will retreat when surrounded. It shows that the security guarantee Russia offers is not unconditional. The governments watching from neighboring countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, both of which brought in Afrika Korps forces after being inspired by Mali's example, are now watching their security model run out of a northern Malian city in trucks, while rebel fighters film it from the roadside. The credibility damage extends beyond Mali. Russia's entire pitch in the Sahel was built on the foundation of results. Results are no longer appearing. There's also the question of what comes next inside Mali itself. The Azawad Liberation Front is now reportedly negotiating with the Russian embassy to secure the withdrawal of Russian forces from additional areas, including Gao, another major strategic city. Each negotiation like that is a further retreat dressed up in diplomatic language. The momentum has shifted. The rebels now know they can beat the Afrika Korps in direct engagement. The Malian army, which relied heavily on Russian support, has lost its defense minister and is under enormous internal pressure. Multiple Malian soldiers were disarmed and taken prisoner during the April 25th attacks. Russia will not completely withdraw from Mali. The economic interests are too significant and the strategic relationships too important for a full exit. Gold mining access, bauxite extraction through Guinean ports, political relationships with the junta. Russia has embedded itself into Mali's economy and governance in ways that cannot be untangled quickly. But the Afrika Korps will be operating from a significantly weaker position going forward. They will need more resources to hold less territory. They will face a more confident and better coordinated insurgency. And they will be doing all of that while Moscow's primary focus and primary resource drain remains hundreds of kilometers to the northeast in Ukraine. The deeper problem here is one of institutional credibility. When the Afrika Korps replaced Wagner, Russia made a specific argument. This new force is more professional, more reliable, more controlled, a proper state-backed military unit rather than a freelancing private army. That was supposed to reassure African governments that were watching Wagner stumble. But what the fall of Kidal actually demonstrated was that the Afrika Korps carries Wagner's weaknesses without Wagner's one genuine advantage, which was a willingness to fight aggressively regardless of cost. The Afrika Korps was cautious where Wagner was reckless. And when a coordinated attack came, caution turned into paralysis, and paralysis turned into a negotiated retreat. For Moscow, this is a credibility problem that money and equipment cannot easily fix. The Malian government, the juntas in Burkina Faso and Niger, and other potential African partners are now watching Russia very carefully. If Russia cannot hold what it has already captured, what exactly is the security guarantee worth? That question does not have a comfortable answer right now. This is what overextension actually looks like when it hits reality. It does not look like a sudden collapse. It looks like a slow accumulation of defeats in places that were supposed to be easy wins. It looks like falling behind in one theater because you are bleeding out in another. It looks like negotiating your exit from cities you raised flags over just 2 years ago. Russia is not finished in Africa. Russia is not finished in Ukraine. But Russia is being forced, by the basic arithmetic of military capacity and economic resources, to confront a reality that it has been avoiding for years. You cannot fight everywhere at once forever. Eventually the gaps start to show. And right now one of those gaps just opened up in a city in northern Mali called Kidal, and the whole world, if it is paying attention, can see exactly what it means. The empire is stretching, and something, somewhere, is about to tear. And to fully grasp the scale of this problem for Moscow, you need to understand one more layer that most coverage misses entirely. Russia's strategy in Africa was never just about security contracts. It was never just about sending mercenaries to prop up weak governments. It was always about something far more ambitious. Moscow was trying to build an alternative global infrastructure, a network of political relationships, military basing rights, resource extraction deals, and diplomatic alliances that would reduce Russia's isolation in a world where the West had turned against it following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Africa, with its dozens of nations, its vast natural resources, and its historical resentment of European colonialism, was the perfect arena for this project. The Sahel specifically, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, became Russia's proving ground. When French forces were expelled from these countries one after another between 2021 and 2023, Russia stepped into each gap with Wagner or Africa Corps forces. Moscow was methodically building a belt of allied states across the southern edge of the Sahara, connected by shared anti-Western politics, Russian military presence, and economic arrangements that benefited both the ruling juntas and Russian commercial interests. Guinea's port became a logistics hub for Russian military shipments into the region, Russian bauxite and gold extraction. Operations spread alongside the military deployments. Russia was not just selling security, it was colonizing Africa economically, using the language of anti-colonialism to do it. Kidal matters in this context because Kidal was supposed to be the flagship example of this entire project working. A northern Malian city, long held by separatists, retaken with Russian help. Order restored. The junta's out. Authority extended. Russia proven right. When that city falls back into rebel hands 2.5 years later, when Russian forces are surrounded and have to call Algeria for help getting out, the flagship sinks. And when a flagship sinks, every other ship in the fleet starts to look less reliable. The timing also matters. This is happening right now, in the spring of 2026, as the Russia-Ukraine war enters a critical phase of diplomatic maneuvering and continued grinding attrition on the battlefield. Russia needs to project strength on the global stage to maintain its negotiating position with the West. It needs to convince Western governments that isolating Moscow has failed, that Russia remains a powerful global actor with friends and influence on multiple continents. A humiliating retreat from an African city, negotiated through Algerian mediation while rebel fighters record videos of Russian trucks driving away. This is not the image of a powerful global actor. This is the image of a power that overplayed its hand. None of this means Russia collapses tomorrow. Putin has consistently demonstrated an ability to absorb punishment that Western analysts underestimate. Russia's war machine in Ukraine continues grinding forward, despite losses that would have ended most conventional conflicts. The Africa Corps will regroup, reposition, and likely launch new operations in other parts of Mali to demonstrate that it has not been defeated strategically. Russian propaganda will continue to spin the Kidal withdrawal as a tactical adjustment rather than a defeat. And there will be audiences, both in Africa and elsewhere, who will accept that framing. But the long game looks harder for Moscow than it did even a year ago. The Ukraine war has no end clearly in sight, and its resource demands only grow. The Africa project has now suffered a very public failure at its most visible location. The economic strain at home is real and measurable, and the narrative of Russian inevitability, the idea that history is bending toward Moscow's vision of a multipolar world where Russia occupies a seat of true power, that narrative just took a serious hit in a city in the middle of the Sahara Desert. 2 wars, 2 fronts, one empire that cannot fully fund either of them. The math was always going to catch up eventually. In Kidal, on April 25th, 2026, it finally did.